I spotted a middle-aged man standing near the bend in the Bow River Trail, looking confused. His head swiveled from side to side as he studied the surrounding trees, seemingly trying to get his bearings. My boots crunched on the frozen gravel as I approached him, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. This was standard procedure when encountering potentially lost hikers. "Afternoon, sir," I called out when I was about 20 feet away. "Everything okay?" The man turned toward me, relief washing over his face. He wore decent hiking gear, nothing fancy but appropriate for the trails. Dark pants, a blue jacket, and sturdy boots. His short black hair was graying at the temples, and he had the stocky build of someone who stayed reasonably active. "Oh, thank goodness," he said, walking toward me. I was beginning to think I'd be out here all day. I closed the distance between us, taking note of his appearance. Nothing immediately concerning. No visible injuries. No signs of hypothermia despite the cold. I introduced myself as I always did. "I'm Ranger Bentley Owens. Are you lost, sir?" "Colin Maldonado," he said, extending his hand. I shook it briefly, noting how unusually cool his palm felt against mine. "And yes, I'm afraid I am. I got separated from my hiking group about an hour ago. Took a wrong turn somewhere back there." He gestured vaguely toward the eastern fork of the trail. "Which group were you with?" I asked, reaching for my radio. "I can call it in, get you back to them." Something changed in Colin's face when I touched my radio. So subtle I almost missed it. The friendly smile remained, but his eyes went flat and cold, like someone had switched off a light behind them. "No," he said firmly. "No need for that. I'm sure I can find my way back if you just point me in the right direction." I paused, my hand still on the radio. His reaction seemed off. Most lost hikers jumped at the chance for help. "It's no trouble," I assured him. "Standard procedure when someone gets separated from their group. Which trail were they taking today?" I said no, Colin repeated, his voice taking on an edge. "I don't need you to call anyone." That's when I noticed it. We were standing in bright sunshine. One of those clear, crisp winter days when the light bounces off the snow with almost painful brightness. But Colin Maldonado cast no shadow on the trail behind him. I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature crawl up my spine. My eyes dropped to the ground around his feet, confirming what I'd seen. Nothing. Where his shadow should have stretched across the packed snow, there was only empty light. I looked back at his face, trying to keep my expression neutral. Now that I was paying closer attention, I realized something else was wrong. The temperature was well below freezing. I could see my own breath forming clouds with every exhale. But when Colin spoke, no vapor emerged from his mouth. The memory of Herman Bell's warning crashed into my thoughts. 5 years ago, during my training, the veteran ranger had pulled me aside after a shift. "Listen, kid," Herman had said in his gruff voice, blue eyes serious beneath bushy white eyebrows. "There's something you need to know about this place. If you ever come across someone who claims they're lost but refuses your help when you offer it, you turn around and walk away. Don't argue, don't push. Just leave." I'd laughed nervously. "What, like they're stubborn hikers or something?" Herman hadn't smiled back. "No, because they're not hikers, and they're not lost." I hadn't understood then. I did now. "Well," I said, taking a casual step backward, "if you're sure you don't need help, I won't insist." I kept my voice steady despite the hammering in my chest. "The main visitor center is about 2 miles that way." I pointed west, away from the direction he'd indicated his group had gone. Colin didn't move. He just watched me, his head tilted slightly to one side. The friendly confusion was gone from his face, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You know," he said, his voice now flat and emotionless, "I think I would like your help after all, Ranger Owens." The way he said my name made my skin crawl. I took another step back, I really should get back to my patrol, I said. Lots of ground to cover before dark. I continued backing away slowly, maintaining eye contact. Colin remained perfectly still, watching me retreat. Not a single muscle in his body moved, not even to breathe. "I'll be seeing you again, Ranger," he called after me, his voice carrying unnaturally in the still air. I didn't respond. I kept walking backward until I reached the curve in the trail, then turned and moved quickly away, resisting the urge to run. When I glanced back a minute later, the trail behind me was empty. Colin Maldonado was gone. As soon as I was out of sight, I grabbed my radio and called headquarters. "Base, this is Owens. I need information on any hiking groups in the Bow River Trail area today, particularly any reporting a missing member. Over." The radio crackled. "Owens, this is Base. No reports of missing hikers today. All registered groups have checked in. Want us to double check?" Over. "Please do," I replied. "I just encountered someone claiming to be separated from their group. Name given was Colin Maldonado. Over." "Stand by, Owens." I waited, scanning the trees around me, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence. "Owens, this is Base. Confirmed no hiking groups have reported anyone missing. No Colin Maldonado registered with any groups today. Do you need backup? Over." I considered the question. What would I tell them? That I'd met a man without a shadow. "Negative, Base. Just keep an eye out for anyone matching that description. Middle-aged male, black hair with gray temples, blue jacket, about 5'10". I'll file a full report when I return." Over and out. I finished my patrol route, constantly looking over my shoulder. I never saw Colin again that day. When I returned to headquarters, I checked with the other rangers. No one had encountered Colin Maldonado. The next morning, a search team swept the area where I'd seen him, looking for signs of a potentially lost hiker. They found nothing. No footprints besides my own. No disturbed vegetation. No evidence anyone else had been there at all. That night, I wrote the first entry in what would become my survival journal. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Rule number 1. If someone claims to be lost but refuses help when offered, walk away immediately. Do not engage further. They are not what they appear to be." I didn't understand what I'd encountered on the trail that day. I still don't. But I know that by remembering Herman's warning and trusting my instincts, I survived my first brush with whatever lurks in the shadows of Banff National Park. I heard my name floating through the trees, soft and distant at first. "Ranger Bentley? Is anyone there? Please help me." The voice belonged to a young girl. Couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 from the sound of it. I stopped walking, my boots frozen mid-step on the gravel path. 5 years into my ranger career at Banff had taught me to pay attention to the details that didn't fit. This voice definitely didn't fit. "I'm scared," the child's voice called again, wavering with what sounded like genuine fear. "I can't find my mom and dad." Every muscle in my body tensed with the instinct to move toward the sound. That's what we were trained to do, help people in distress. I took half a step toward the dense line of trees where the voice originated, then caught myself. The memory hit me like ice water. Ruth Lloyd had pulled me aside 3 years ago, her face tight with grief as she told me about Tim Navarro. He'd been her partner, a good guy with a big heart. Tim had heard a child calling for help while on solo patrol. Ruth said he'd radioed in, that he was going to investigate, that he couldn't just leave a kid out there alone. They found his body 2 days later at the bottom of a steep ravine. His neck and limbs were bent at angles that weren't possible in life. Ruth told me his face had been frozen in an expression of pure terror. "Hello?" The voice called again, louder this time. "Please, I need help. I'm lost." I backed up until I was firmly in the center of the trail. My hand moved to my radio, but I didn't call it in yet. The voice wasn't moving. It stayed fixed in that one spot off trail, about 50 yards into the trees. "Ranger Bentley, I know you're there. Please help me." The voice had changed slightly, knowing my name now, which I hadn't said aloud. My mouth went dry. I turned and continued walking along the designated trail, away from the voice. The forest around me had gone silent. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps on the path. "Wait! Don't leave me here alone!" The voice rose in pitch, panic threading through the words. "I'm just a little girl. Please!" I kept walking, my pace steady and deliberate. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air. The voice began to follow me, keeping pace somewhere in the trees to my right. "My leg is hurt. I can't walk." The voice had changed tactics, adding details to make the story more compelling. "There's blood everywhere. Please, I need help." I focused on the trail ahead, counting my steps, trying to block out the increasingly desperate pleas. 127 steps later, the voice changed again. "My parents will give you money. They're rich. They'll reward you for finding me." When that didn't work, the tone shifted dramatically. "Why are you ignoring me? What kind of person leaves a child alone in the woods? You're supposed to help people." The guilt tactics continued for another 15 minutes as I maintained my course. I kept my eyes forward, though every few seconds I scanned my surroundings, making sure nothing was approaching from the trees. "You're a bad person, Ranger Bentley," the voice hissed, dropping any pretense of being a scared child. Just like Tim was. He tried to help me too. My blood went cold at the mention of Tim's name. I hadn't said anything about Tim Navarro. The voice shouldn't have known that connection. Tim screamed all the way down. The voice continued, now sounding like it was smiling. It was such a long fall. "Do you want to know what his last words were?" I walked faster, my hand tight around my flashlight. The voice kept pace. "I'll find you when you're alone, Bentley. When you think you're safe. I'll be waiting." The threats continued for another 20 minutes as I made my way back toward the main trail junction. The voice grew more distorted, sometimes sounding like the child again, sometimes deeper, almost guttural. It mixed pleading with threats, promises with gruesome descriptions. Then, as I rounded a bend in the trail that opened into a wider clearing, the voice suddenly stopped. The normal sounds of the forest gradually returned. The rustle of leaves, distant bird calls. Whatever had been following me was gone, or at least no longer interested in making itself known. I continued my patrol route with constant vigilance, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. When I finally reached headquarters 3 hours later, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool temperature. Captain Justin Allen was at his desk reviewing reports when I knocked on his office door. "Come in, Owens," he said, looking up from his paperwork. I closed the door behind me and stood at attention, the habit still strong from my early training days. "Sir, I need to report an incident from today's patrol of the eastern section." Allen put down his pen and gave me his full attention. He was a good captain that way. When something seemed important, he listened. I described the voice I'd heard, the way it had called my name and followed me along the trail, how it had known about Tim Navarro. "Were there any reports of missing children in the park today?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Captain Allen shook his head. "None. We've had 37 families with children check in today, and all are accounted for. No distress calls, no separated parties." He leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "You did the right thing, Owens, staying on trail." He didn't say more, didn't need to. We both knew what had happened to Tim. That night I sat at the small desk in my cabin and opened the leather-bound journal I'd started after my encounter with Colin Maldonado. I'd written only one rule so far. Now I added a second. Rule number 2. Never follow voices in the forest, no matter how convincing or desperate they sound. I closed the journal and put it in the drawer beside my bed. 2 rules now. I had a feeling there would be more before my time at Banff was done. I checked my GPS coordinates against the map, making sure I was in the correct section of the forest for today's survey. The early morning sun filtered through the canopy overhead as I moved between the trees, marking locations and taking photographs for the quarterly ecological assessment. Standard procedure, but necessary for tracking forest health and changes over time. Tree 47, I muttered to myself, punching the data into my handheld device. Lodgepole pine, approximately 70 feet tall, 22-inch diameter. I continued through my assigned grid, methodically documenting each significant tree with a numbered tag, GPS coordinates, and several photographs from different angles. The work was tedious but peaceful, just me in the forest, away from the constant stream of lost hikers and rule-breaking campers. About 3 hours into my survey, I came across a massive Douglas fir that stopped me in my tracks. It towered above the surrounding trees, at least 150 feet tall, with a trunk so wide it would take 3 rangers linking arms to encircle it. "Well, aren't you something?" I said, craning my neck to see the uppermost branches. The tree was magnificent, far older than anything else in this section. Its bark was deeply furrowed, creating intricate patterns that spoke of centuries standing in this exact spot. I pulled out my camera and took several photographs, circling the entire trunk to capture it from every angle. Then I carefully entered its precise coordinates into my GPS unit, double-checking the numbers before saving them. Tree 62, Douglas fir, estimated age 300+ years, I recorded into my voice memo. Unusual size for this elevation and soil type. No visible disease or damage. I placed a metal tag on the north side of the trunk, hammering it gently into the bark at chest height. The massive fir was a landmark worth noting. I'd use it as a reference point when I returned tomorrow to finish the eastern section of the grid. By late afternoon, I'd completed about 2/3 of my assigned area. The sun was getting lower and I still had a 40-minute hike back to my vehicle. I packed up my gear, taking one last look at the giant Douglas fir before heading back to headquarters. That evening, I transferred my data to the main system and prepared my equipment for the next day. I'd return at first light to complete the remaining section. Morning came quickly. I arrived at the trailhead just as dawn was breaking, eager to finish the survey and get the paperwork done before the weekend. I hiked back to where I'd left off, using my GPS to navigate to the exact spot. When I reached the area where I'd ended yesterday's survey, something felt immediately wrong. I stood still, looking around slowly, trying to identify what had triggered my unease. The giant Douglas fir should have been visible from here. It had been such a dominant presence in this part of the forest that its absence was jarring. I pulled out my GPS and checked the coordinates I'd recorded yesterday. "That can't be right," I said to myself, looking at the reading. According to my GPS, I was standing exactly where I should be. But the massive tree wasn't where I'd left it. I walked to the specific coordinates I'd recorded for tree 62, expecting to find the giant fir. Instead, there was just empty space, a gap in the canopy overhead. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. I pulled up yesterday's data on my device and double-checked the numbers. No mistake. This was exactly where the Douglas fir had been standing. "What the hell?" I muttered, turning in a slow circle. That's when I saw it. 30 feet away, standing tall and unmistakable, was the giant Douglas fir. The same distinctive bark patterns, the same massive height and girth. Even the metal tag I'd hammered in was there, still at chest height on the north side. I approached it cautiously, checking the ground around the tree for signs of disturbance. There were none. No massive root ball exposed, no trail of disturbed earth, no broken smaller trees that would indicate it had somehow fallen and been repositioned. The forest floor around the Douglas fir was completely undisturbed, leaf litter perfectly intact, smaller plants growing right up to the trunk as if they'd been there for years. It was as if the tree had simply picked itself up and walked 30 feet overnight. I felt my mouth go dry as I remembered a conversation with Reese Turner 3 months earlier. We'd been doing maintenance on the eastern trails when she'd suddenly stopped working and stared into the forest. "You ever notice a tree that's not where it should be, Bentley?" she'd asked, her voice low. I'd laughed it off. "Trees don't exactly move around, Reese." She hadn't smiled back. "They do here. Not often, but they do. And when they move, it means something old is waking up. Something that was here long before the park, before people." I'd dismissed it as ranger folklore at the time. Every park had its stories. But standing here now, staring at a 150-foot tree that had somehow relocated itself without disturbing so much as a pine needle on the ground, Reese's warning echoed in my head. "When you see a tree that's moved," she'd continued, "don't investigate. Don't try to figure it out. Just leave the area and don't go back. The curious ones never make it home." I took several steps backward, keeping my eyes on the Douglas fir. My hand went to my radio, and I pressed the call button. "Base, this is Ranger Owens, over." A brief crackle, then, "Go ahead, Bentley." "Is Captain Wilson available?" "Stand by." I waited, never taking my eyes off the tree. It looked perfectly normal, just a tree standing where no tree had been yesterday. "Owens, this is Wilson. What's up?" I hesitated. I couldn't tell him the truth. No one reported the weird stuff directly. That was how you got psych evaluations and desk duty. "Sir, I'm having some issues with my survey equipment. GPS is giving inconsistent readings, and I think the camera's moisture damaged. Request reassignment to a different sector until I can get this gear checked out." There was a pause, and I worried he'd ask for more details. "Approved. Head back and check in with Landers. He needs help with visitor center duty today anyway." "Thank you, sir. Heading back now. Owens out." I clipped the radio back to my belt and began backing away from the Douglas fir, unwilling to turn my back on it. Only when I was a good 50 yards away did I finally turn and walk quickly down the trail. I never returned to that section of forest. I filed my partial survey data, but conveniently lost the coordinates for Tree 62. Some things weren't meant to be in the official record. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. I flipped past my first 2 rules, the pen hovering over the blank page before I began to write. Rule number 3, beware of things that move when they shouldn't, and never investigate them further. I closed the journal and put it away in my drawer. 3 rules now. I had a feeling there would be more before my time at Banff was done. I wiped sweat from my forehead as our search team trudged through the dense underbrush of Banff's remote northern section. Jerry walked a few paces ahead, his stocky frame pushing aside branches with practiced efficiency. This was our 3rd straight day looking for Ella Pearson, a 34-year-old camper who'd gone missing from her family's campsite nearly a week ago. "Anything on your side?" Jerry called back to me, his voice carrying easily through the quiet forest. "Nothing yet," I answered, scanning the ground for disturbed vegetation or any sign of human passage. The search had grown more desperate with each passing day. Ella's family, husband and 2 kids, waited back at headquarters, their faces growing more hollow as hope dwindled. We'd expanded our search grid farther north than initially planned, pushing into rarely traveled sections of the park where hikers seldom ventured. "Let's check near the stream," Jerry suggested, pointing toward the sound of running water through a thick stand of pines. If she was lost and thirsty, she might have headed that way. I nodded, following as Jerry adjusted our course. Despite the physical exhaustion of 3 days searching, Jerry maintained his characteristic optimism. That was his nature. Always believing we'd find people alive, always the first to volunteer for rescue operations. In our 4 years working together, I'd come to rely on that unwavering hope, even when my own experience made me more cautious. We broke through the tree line and found ourselves at the edge of a small, clear stream cutting through moss-covered rocks. The water bubbled pleasantly, creating white foam as it navigated the uneven stream bed. Jerry stopped so abruptly I nearly bumped into him. "Holy shit," he whispered. "Bentley, look." About 30 yards downstream sat a woman on a flat rock beside the water. Even from this distance, I recognized Ella Pearson from the photos her family had provided. Shoulder-length blonde hair, slim build, wearing the same blue hiking clothes she'd gone missing in. "Ella!" Jerry called out, his voice bright with relief. "Ella Pearson?" The woman turned toward us with an unnaturally smooth motion. Something inside me tensed immediately. Her movements seemed too controlled, too precise. As she stood up, I noticed her skin had a strange, waxy quality to it, like a department store mannequin. The light filtering through the trees caught her eyes, and they reflected back like a deer's in headlights. A bright, animal-like gleam. "Jerry," I said quietly, grabbing his arm. "Wait." But Jerry was already moving forward, relief evident in his hurried steps. "Ma'am, we're park rangers. We've been looking for you for days. Are you hurt?" The woman smiled, and my stomach tightened. Her mouth stretched too wide, her teeth too white and perfect. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. From her mouth, from the trees around us, from the stream itself, creating an unsettling chorus. "I've been waiting for someone to find me," she said, the words overlapping with themselves in a way that made my skin crawl. "I'm so glad you're here." I tightened my grip on Jerry's arm. "That's not her," I hissed. "Jerry, stay back." Jerry glanced at me, confusion crossing his face. "What are you talking about? It's her. It's Ella." "Look at her eyes," I insisted. "Look at how she's moving. Something's wrong." The thing wearing Ella's face took a step toward us, still smiling that too wide smile. "Please," it said, the word echoing unnaturally. "I need help getting back. I've been lost for so long." "We're going to get you back to your family," Jerry assured her, pulling free from my grip. "They've been worried sick about you." "Jerry, don't—" I started, reaching for my radio, but Jerry was already moving toward her, his training and instinct to help overriding any caution. I watched in growing horror as he approached the woman, who stood perfectly still, head tilted at an angle that no human neck should allow. "Are you injured?" Jerry asked, now only 10 feet away from her. "Can you walk okay?" The thing that looked like Ella didn't answer. It simply watched him with those reflective eyes, its head slowly tilting further to the side until it was nearly horizontal. "Jerry," I shouted, "get back here now." Too late. The creature lunged forward with impossible speed, a blur of motion that my eyes could barely track. One moment, it stood calmly by the stream. The next, it was on Jerry, knocking him backward onto the rocky ground. I watched in frozen terror as its mouth opened far wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth where normal human teeth had been seconds before. Jerry screamed as the creature tore into his throat with savage efficiency, blood spraying across the rocks. His hands came up trying to push it away, but the thing had inhuman strength. It pinned him down as it continued to feed, making wet, horrible sounds that will haunt me until the day I die. I fumbled for my sidearm, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get a clean draw. The creature looked up at me, Jerry's blood dripping from its chin, its eyes now completely black and reflective. It smiled again, showing those terrible teeth before returning to its meal. Self-preservation finally kicked in. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face as I fled back the way we had come. Jerry's screams followed me, growing weaker by the second until they stopped altogether. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming. When I reached a clearing about 100 yards away, I finally managed to pull out my radio with trembling hands. "Emergency! Officer down!" I gasped into the receiver, requesting immediate armed backup at my GPS location. "Jerry—" I choked on the words. "Ranger Diaz is down. We found something. Something that looks like the missing woman, but isn't." "Ranger Owens, please clarify. came Captain Allen's voice, steady but concerned. "Send everyone you've got with weapons," I said, my voice breaking. "Jerry's dead. The thing that killed him looks like Ella Pearson, but it's not human. I repeat, it's not human." There was a pause on the other end. "Copy that. Armed response team deploying now. Stay in position if safe to do so. ETA 20 minutes. I wanted to keep running, to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing by the stream. But I couldn't leave Jerry like that. I owed him better. So I waited, scanning the forest constantly, jumping at every sound until I heard the approach of the response team. 6 Rangers arrived, all armed with rifles. Captain Allen was with them, his face grim as he took in my blood-spattered uniform and wild eyes. "This way," I said, leading them back toward the stream. I couldn't stop shaking. When we reached the spot where it had happened, the creature was gone. Only Jerry remained, or what was left of him. His body lay sprawled across the rocks, his throat and chest torn open, chunks of flesh missing from his arms and torso. Several Rangers turned away, unable to look. One vomited into the bushes. "Jesus Christ," Captain Allen whispered, kneeling beside Jerry's remains. "What did this?" "It looked like Ella Pearson," I said, my voice hollow. "But it wasn't her. Its eyes reflected light like an animal's. Its voice came from everywhere at once, and its teeth—" I trailed off, unable to describe the horror I'd witnessed. We searched the area for hours but found no sign of the creature. No footprints, no blood trail, nothing to indicate which direction it had gone. It was as if it had simply vanished. 3 days later, a different search team found the real Ella Pearson. Her body was discovered buried under a pile of rocks about 5 miles from where her family had been camping. The medical examiner determined she'd been dead for over a week, days before Jerry and I had encountered the thing wearing her face. I sat at my desk that night, Jerry's death weighing heavily on me as I opened my journal. My hand trembled as I wrote beneath my previous 3 rules. Rule number 4: never approach someone who seems off, no matter how harmless they appear. I stared at the words for a long time, thinking about Jerry's final moments. If I'd been more insistent, if I'd physically restrained him from approaching that thing, he might still be alive. The guilt was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. But I knew this rule might save others, might prevent another Ranger from suffering Jerry's fate. So I underlined it twice, closed the journal, and placed it in my drawer. I heard Captain Wilson's voice coming from somewhere off the main trail, about 50 yards to my left. "Bentley, help, I'm over here." The voice was unmistakable, the same authoritative tone I'd heard giving orders at morning briefing, now strained with pain. "I fell down the embankment, my legs trapped under a log. I need help." I stopped walking, my boots crunching in the fresh snow as I turned toward the sound. The winter forest was still, branches heavy with last night's snowfall. The temperature had dropped to about 10 degrees, and my breath clouded in front of my face. "Bentley, can you hear me? Please!" The voice called again, more desperate this time. "I can't move." Something felt wrong. I'd seen Captain Wilson at headquarters just 3 hours ago, reviewing patrol schedules in his office. He'd mentioned paperwork that would keep him desk-bound all day. Why would he be out here now, off-trail in the northern section? I took half a step toward the voice, then stopped. The memory of Jerry's death flashed through my mind. The creature that had perfectly mimicked Ella Pearson, right down to her blue hiking clothes. The thing with 2 white teeth that had torn my partner apart while I watched. "I'm losing feeling in my leg," Wilson's voice called. "Please hurry." I backed away instead, moving to the center of the trail. The voice sounded exactly like Wilson. The same pitch, the same slight Midwestern accent, the same way he pronounced my name. But something about the situation felt calculated, like a trap being set. I unclipped my radio from my belt and pressed the call button. "Base, This is Ranger Owens on North Ridge Trail. Do you copy? The radio crackled with static before a response came through. This is base. Go ahead, Owens. Is Captain Wilson there? Can you put him on? There was a pause, some muffled conversation in the background. Hold for Captain Wilson. The voice in the trees called again. Bentley, I'm losing blood. Where are you? My radio crackled. Owens, this is Wilson. What's the situation? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. I kept my eyes fixed on the tree line where the calls continued coming from. Sir, just confirming your location. Are you currently at headquarters? Affirmative. Been here since 7 this morning. Why? What's happening out there? I swallowed hard, watching my breath form clouds in the cold air. Sir, I'm hearing your voice calling for help from about 50 yards off trail, claiming you've fallen and injured your leg. There was a long pause before Wilson responded. That's a negative, Owens. I'm at my desk reviewing incident reports. Have been all morning. Understood, sir. Request permission to continue standard patrol route without investigating the voice. Permission granted. Maintain trail position. Do you need backup? I considered it, but the voice had fallen silent since I'd made the radio call. Negative, sir. I'll complete my route and report back. Copy that. Be careful out there, Owens. Wilson out. I clipped the radio back to my belt and continued walking, picking up my pace slightly. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no rustling, not even the sound of wind through the branches. Just the crunch of my boots in the snow. I finished my patrol route without further incident, constantly scanning the tree line and checking over my shoulder. The voice didn't call again. By the time I returned to headquarters, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered grounds. I found Brittany Hoffman in the equipment room, checking her gear after her own patrol. At 61, Brittany was the most experienced ranger in Banff, with nearly 40 years in the park. Her silver-gray hair was tucked under a wool hat, and her weathered face looked up as I entered. Rough day? She asked, noting my expression. I set my pack down and started unloading my equipment. Had something strange happen on North Ridge. Strange how? She stopped what she was doing, giving me her full attention. Heard Captain Wilson calling for help off trail. Said he'd fallen and hurt his leg. I hung up my jacket. Except Wilson was here at headquarters the whole time. Brittany nodded slowly, unsurprised. False distress calls. They're getting better at it. They? She shrugged. Whatever's out there. Been happening as long as I've worked here. They learn our voices, use them against us. How? I mean, it sounded exactly like him. Don't know how. Just know it happens. She picked up her pack and slung it over her shoulder. Anthony Turner followed a hiker's voice off trail 7 years ago. Search team found what was left of him 3 days later. And Autumn Singh, she heard crying like a woman in distress. Radioed it in, went to investigate. Never came back. I remembered the names from the memorial plaque in the main hall. So they mimic voices to lure us away from the trails. Smart, right? They know we're trained to help people in distress. Brittany's eyes looked tired, resigned. That's why the old-timers have rules. Never follow voices. Never help someone who refuses to be helped. Never investigate something that feels wrong. I've been keeping a list, I admitted. Got 4 rules so far. She nodded approvingly. Good. Add this one. Never respond to familiar voices calling for help unless you can verify their identity first. Might save your life someday. I'll add it tonight. Brittany headed for the door, then paused. Oh, and Bentley, check for tracks tomorrow. They almost always leave tracks. The next morning, I returned to the spot on North Ridge Trail where I'd heard the voice. The forest was quiet, peaceful in the early light, with fresh powder from an overnight dusting of snow. I scanned the area carefully, looking for any sign of disturbance. About 40 yards from the trail, I found them. Deep impressions in the snow, partially filled by the fresh powder but still clearly visible. They weren't human footprints. They weren't animal tracks either, at least not from any animal I recognized after 15 years as a ranger. The tracks were roughly circular, about 14 inches across, with what looked like 5 pointed extensions, like fingers or claws, at the front of each impression. They were spaced about 4 feet apart, suggesting something large had made them. They led from deeper in the forest to the spot where the voice had called from, then continued parallel to the trail for about 100 yards before veering off into the dense trees. I took several photos with my camera, careful not to get too close to the tracks themselves. Whatever had made them was heavy. The impressions went deep into the snow, down to the frozen ground beneath. That evening, I sat at my desk and opened my leather-bound journal. I flipped past the first 4 rules I'd written. Rule number 1. If someone claims to be lost but refuses help when offered, walk away immediately. Do not engage further. They are not what they appear to be. Rule number 2. Never follow voices in the forest, no matter how convincing or desperate they sound. Rule number 3. Beware of things that move when they shouldn't, and never investigate them further. Rule number 4. Never approach someone who seems off, no matter how harmless they appear. I picked up my pen and wrote, Rule number 5. Never respond to familiar voices calling for help unless you can verify their identity first. I underlined it twice, then closed the journal and placed it in my desk drawer. The next week, I was assigned to train a group of 3 new rangers, fresh graduates from the conservation program, eager and idealistic. As part of their orientation, I went through safety protocols, including my 5 rules. These aren't official park guidelines, I explained as we walked a training route, but they've kept me alive for 5 years in Banff. One of the rookies, Lisa Chen, nodded seriously and wrote them down. The other 2 exchanged glances. So you're saying the forest, what, mimics people? Asked Mark Donovan, the youngest of the group at 23. Like some kind of predator? I'm saying there are things in this park that we don't understand, I replied. Things that have killed experienced rangers who ignored the warning signs. Like what happened to your partner? Lisa asked quietly. I nodded, not wanting to revisit the memory of Jerry's death. Like what happened to Jerry and others before him. The 3rd rookie, Devin Williams, laughed nervously. No offense, but this sounds like the kind of stories they tell at summer camp. You know, to scare the kids. I wish they were just stories. I stopped walking and turned to face them. Look, you don't have to believe me. Most new rangers don't, until they experience something themselves. But if you hear voices calling for help off trail, or meet someone who seems slightly wrong, or notice something that's moved when it shouldn't have, remember what I told you. It might save your life. Devin and Mark still looked skeptical, but Lisa's expression was solemn. I could tell she, at least, was taking me seriously. As we continued the training hike, I wondered how many of them would still be here in a year. How many would learn the hard way that my rules weren't superstition, but survival. I heard a woman crying in the forest. The sound cut through the quiet darkness of my night patrol, a desperate sobbing that pulled at my gut. I stopped walking and listened more carefully. The trail stretched ahead of me, barely visible in the weak beam of my flashlight. The crying came again, this time with words. Help me. Please, someone help me. The voice broke between sobs. It's Peyton York. I'm hurt. I can't move. I felt my blood run cold. I knew that voice. The slight catch in the vowels, the particular way she pronounced her name. It sounded exactly like Peyton York, a ranger I'd worked with for nearly 2 years. But Peyton had transferred to Jasper National Park 6 months ago. I'd helped her pack her SUV the day she left. Bentley, the voice called. Is that you? Please help me. I fell down a ravine. I think my leg is broken. I switched off my flashlight and stood completely still, The crying continued, coming from somewhere deep among the trees to my right, maybe 50 yards off the trail. I could hear the panic in her voice, the pain. If I didn't know better, I'd swear it was really her. "Bentley, I can see your light. Please, I've been out here for hours." I reached for my radio, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark woods where the crying originated. My hand was steady, but my mouth had gone dry. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath. "Base, this is Owens," I said quietly into the radio. After a moment of static, the night dispatcher responded, "Go ahead, Owens." "I need a location check on Ranger Peyton York," I said, my voice low. "Immediate confirmation." The crying grew louder, more frantic. "Bentley, please. I'm losing too much blood. Why won't you help me?" The radio crackled. "Stand by, checking." I remained motionless on the trail, fighting every instinct to rush toward the sound. The voice was so convincing. The specific way she said my name, the pitch of her panic. It was perfect. Too perfect. "Owens, this is Base. Confirmed that Ranger York is currently stationed at Jasper National Park. According to their dispatch, she's on duty right now. Do you need further verification?" "Negative," I replied. "Thanks, Base." "Bentley, they're wrong." The voice in the forest wailed, somehow having heard the radio exchange. "I came back to visit. I wanted to surprise everyone. Please, I'm dying out here." I clipped my radio back to my belt and took a step backward, staying centered on the trail. The crying shifted to a different tone, more desperate, more pitiful. "I'm so cold," the voice whimpered. "It hurts so much. Please don't leave me alone out here." I continued my patrol route, walking at a measured pace. The crying followed me, somehow keeping pace through the trees parallel to the trail. For nearly 20 minutes, the voice begged and pleaded, describing injuries in vivid detail, calling my name with increasing desperation. "You're going to let me die out here?" The voice sobbed. "After everything we went through together?" I kept walking, my flashlight beam steady on the trail ahead. I'd seen what happened to Jerry when he approached the thing that wasn't Ella Pearson. I'd heard the stories about Anthony Turner and Autumn Singh. I knew better. An hour into my patrol, the crying changed tactics. The voice became angry, accusing. "You coward! You know it's me. What kind of ranger leaves someone to die?" I maintained my pace, focusing on my breathing, on the solid ground beneath my boots. The voice continued for another hour, alternating between pitiful sobs and rage-filled screams. Eventually, it settled into a continuous, heart-wrenching weeping that followed me throughout my entire patrol route. 3 hours later, as I neared the end of my shift, the crying had become background noise, still disturbing, still perfectly mimicking Peyton's voice, but I'd grown somewhat numb to it. The sky began to lighten at the eastern edge of the forest as I completed my final loop. When dawn broke fully, the crying stopped abruptly. The sudden silence felt almost as unnerving as the hours of sobbing had been. I waited until the sun was properly up before I returned to the area where I'd first heard the crying. Staying on the trail, I scanned the forest, looking for any signs of disturbance. About 40 yards in, something caught my eye. A flash of pale wood against the dark bark of the surrounding trees. I raised my binoculars and focused on the spot. Several trees had been marked, deep gouges torn into their trunks. I took photos with my camera, using the zoom lens to capture the details without leaving the trail. The claw marks were enormous, running in sets of 4 parallel lines. They were positioned at least 9 feet up the trunks, far higher than a bear could reach, even standing on its hind legs. And the depth of the gouges, at least 2 inches deep into solid wood, suggested strength beyond any known animal in the park. When my shift ended, I headed straight to headquarters with my camera. Captain Wilson was in his office reviewing reports. I knocked on his open door. "Owens?" he said, looking up. "How was night patrol?" "Interesting. I replied, stepping inside. I need to show you something. I connected my camera to his computer and pulled up the photos of the claw marks. Wilson's expression changed as he looked through them, his usual professional detachment giving way to something darker. "Where did you find these?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "North section, about 2 miles in from checkpoint 3, I said. There was a voice in the forest all night, crying, begging for help. It sounded exactly like Peyton York." Wilson nodded slowly, still staring at the images on his screen. "But you stayed on the trail." It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes, sir." He leaned back in his chair, looking at me directly now. "These marks have been found before, at sites where rangers disappeared." The implication hung in the air between us. If I had followed the voice, "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," Wilson said finally. "I'll send a team to document the site properly." He paused. "Good work staying on trail, Owens." That evening, I sat at my desk and opened my leather-bound journal. I flipped past the first 5 rules I'd written over the years, each one learned through blood and loss. I picked up my pen and added a 6th. Rule number 6. Never investigate crying or distress sounds at night, no matter how convincing or desperate they may seem. I underlined it twice, thinking about the perfect mimicry of Peyton's voice, the hours of convincing pleas and those terrible claw marks high on the trees. I closed the journal and placed it back in my drawer, wondering what new horrors waited in Banff's forests and what new rules I would need to survive them. I stood at the head of the trail, watching the group of 5 new rangers adjust their gear. The morning sun filtered through the pines, catching on their shiny new badges. Most of them looked nervous, except for Jason Parker. The kid was 24, fresh out of training, with a cocky smile that hadn't left his face since orientation began 3 days ago. "All right, listen up," I said, waiting until I had their full attention. "Before we start today's demonstration patrol, we need to go over the rules one more time." A collective groan rose from the group. Jason rolled his eyes dramatically. "Something funny, Parker?" I asked. "No, sir," he said, not bothering to hide his smirk. "Just wondering when we'll get to the actual ranger work instead of ghost stories." The other rookies shifted uncomfortably. Lisa Chen, who'd been taking notes diligently all week, shot Jason a warning look. "These aren't ghost stories," I said, keeping my voice level. "These are survival guidelines that have kept me alive for 15 years in this park." I pulled out my notebook and flipped it open. Rule number 1. If someone claims to be lost but refuses help when offered, walk away immediately. Do not engage further. Jason snorted. "Come on. Who refuses help when they're lost?" "Things that aren't human," I said flatly. 3 years ago, Ranger Martinez approached what looked like a lost hiker. The hiker refused help, Martinez insisted. They found pieces of him scattered across half a mile of forest. That silenced the group momentarily. I continued through the list. Rule number 2. Never follow voices in the forest, no matter how convincing they sound. Rule number 3. Beware of things that move when they shouldn't, and never investigate them further. Rule number 4. Never approach someone who seems off, no matter how harmless they appear. Rule number 5. Never respond to familiar voices calling for help, unless you can verify their identity first. And rule number 6. Never investigate crying or distress sounds at night, no matter how convincing or desperate they seem. I closed my notebook and looked at each of their faces. These rules aren't suggestions. They're the difference between coming home at night or becoming another statistic. Jason raised his hand with exaggerated politeness. "With all due respect, sir, we've been trained in search and rescue. Our job is literally to help people in distress. What you're saying goes against everything in the manual." "The manual was written for national parks where the only dangers are bears, weather, and stupid tourists," I replied. "Banff has other things." Like what? Jason challenged. Moving trees? Monsters? Ghost hikers? I stared at him hard. Like whatever took Jerry Diaz, my partner for 4 years. Whatever ripped his throat out while wearing the face of a missing camper. That shut him up, but I could see the disbelief in his eyes. He thought I was traumatized, seeing things that weren't there. I'd seen that look before. Let's move out, I said. Stay on the trail, stay together, and for God's sake, follow the rules. We hiked for about 2 hours, with me pointing out trail markers and explaining standard patrol procedures. The rookies were attentive, asking good questions about wildlife management and visitor interactions, all except Jason, who kept wandering off to examine plants or rock formations, forcing me to call him back repeatedly. We were about to turn back when I spotted them through a break in the trees, an elderly couple standing just off the main trail, looking at a map. The man wore khaki pants and a plaid shirt, with a baseball cap shading his eyes. The woman had on hiking pants and a light blue windbreaker, with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. I signaled for the group to stop and approached cautiously, staying on the trail. "Good afternoon," I called out. "I'm Ranger Owens. Are you folks doing all right today?" The couple looked up simultaneously, too simultaneously. Their movements were perfectly synchronized in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "We're just fine, thank you," the woman said, her voice oddly flat. "Are you sure? You look a bit turned around." "I'd be happy to help you find your way," I offered, already knowing what the response would be. "No, thank you," the man said with the same inflection as his wife. "We don't need any help." I took a step back. "All right then. The visitor center is about 2 miles that way if you change your mind." I pointed in the opposite direction of where they seemed to be headed. I turned back to the rookie group and spoke quietly. "This is exactly what I was talking about. Rule number 1, they're lost but refusing help. We walk away now." Jason laughed loudly. "Seriously? They're just a couple of stubborn old people. My grandparents are the same way, hate asking for directions." "Parker, get back here," I ordered as he stepped off the trail. "I'm just going to show them where they are on the map," he called back, already walking toward the couple. "It'll take 2 seconds." "That's a direct order, Parker. Stay on the trail." The other rookies watched with wide eyes as Jason ignored me and continued toward the elderly couple who stood perfectly still, watching his approach with blank expressions. "Hey, folks," Jason said cheerfully when he was about 10 feet away. "I can see you're looking at Sector 4 of the trail map, but you're actually in Sector 6. If you're trying to get to the waterfall, you'll want to—" He stopped mid-sentence. I saw his body stiffen. The elderly couple had vanished. 1 second they were there, the next, nothing. Just empty forest where they had been standing. Jason spun around, looking in all directions. "What the hell?" he shouted. "Where did they go?" "Get back on the trail," I called, my hand moving to my radio. "Now, Parker." He stumbled back, his face pale. "Did you see that? They just disappeared." "I saw," I said grimly. "And now you've seen too. Maybe now you'll take the rules seriously." For the rest of the hike back, Jason was quiet. The other rookies kept their distance from him, occasionally throwing nervous glances his way. No one spoke much as we made camp for the night in a designated ranger clearing about 5 miles from headquarters. After dinner, I took first watch while the others set up their tents. Jason sat apart from the group, staring into the fire. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. "Get some sleep," I told them around 9. "We head back at first light." I sat by the dying fire, checking my watch periodically. The forest was unusually quiet. No owls, no rustling of nocturnal animals, just silence and the occasional crack of cooling embers. Around 1 in the morning, I must have dozed off for a few minutes. I jerked awake, immediately sensing something was wrong. I did a quick head count of the tents and realized one was empty. Jason's. "Parker?" I called softly, not wanting to wake the others yet. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and checked around the perimeter of our camp. No sign of him. His sleeping bag was empty, but his backpack was still there. That's when I heard it. A faint voice calling from the darkness beyond our camp. Jason, Jason, I swore under my breath and woke the other rookies. Parker's missing, I told them as they emerged bleary-eyed from their tents. I need you all to stay together right here while I radio this in. I called headquarters and reported the situation. They promised to send a search team at first light. We can't wait that long, Lisa said, already lacing up her boots. He could be hurt. Or he could be dead already, I said bluntly, if he followed that voice. We organized a limited search of the immediate area, staying in tight formation with flashlights sweeping the darkness. We called his name repeatedly, but the only response was the distant echo of what sounded like Jason's voice, always just beyond the reach of our lights. We searched for 3 hours before I called it off until dawn. None of us slept the rest of the night. At first light, we expanded the search with the backup team. By mid-morning, we found Jason's flashlight at the edge of a ravine about half a mile from our camp. The light was still on, batteries nearly dead. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away, just the flashlight, placed almost deliberately at the edge. We spent the next 3 days searching. Teams with dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging, experienced trackers, all found nothing. It was as if Jason Parker had simply ceased to exist after stepping off that trail. On the 4th day, as we gathered our gear to return to headquarters, I looked at the faces of the remaining rookies. The skepticism that had been there at the beginning of the week was gone, replaced by something else, a haunted understanding. They'd seen the couple vanish. They'd heard the voices in the night. They'd watched as an entire search operation failed to find any trace of their colleague. I want you all to write down the 6 rules, I told them. Memorize them. Live by them. They nodded silently. No jokes, no questions. The forest had taught them what I couldn't, that some dangers can't be explained in training manuals, and some rules exist for reasons beyond ordinary understanding. As we hiked back to headquarters, I noticed they all stayed perfectly centered on the trail, their eyes constantly scanning the trees, flinching at every unexpected sound. They'd learned. I just hoped it hadn't cost too much. I was just 5 days away from retirement when the call came in. 3 hikers had gone missing in the northern section of Banff National Park. 2 men and a woman in their early 30s who'd failed to check in at their designated time. Captain Wilson called me into his office that morning, his face already set in that grim expression I'd come to recognize over 15 years of service. "Bentley, I need you on this one," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "I know it's your last week, but we need someone with your experience leading the search team." I picked up the folder without hesitation. After surviving 15 years in Banff, I'd outlasted most of the rangers who'd started with me. I knew why Wilson wanted me specifically. I was one of the few who understood what really lurked in these woods. "Who's on my team?" I asked, scanning the missing persons report. The hikers, Michael Trent, David Holloway, and Sarah Mitchell, had set out 4 days ago on what was supposed to be a week-long backcountry trip. Their emergency beacon had never activated. Wilson handed me a list of 5 names. "I picked rangers who respect your methods," he said meaningfully. I nodded in appreciation. The list included Ruth Chen, who'd started as a rookie 3 years ago and had quickly adopted my survival rules after witnessing what happened to Jason Parker. The other 4 were all veterans who'd been around long enough to see the truth about Banff's forests. "We leave in an hour," I said, tucking the folder under my arm. "I'll brief the team at the trailhead." The morning air was crisp as we gathered at the northern trailhead. Ruth Chen stood checking her pack while Rangers Morales, Blackwood, Thompson, and Garcia listened to my final instructions. "We follow the rules," I said, making eye contact with each of them. "Stay on marked trails whenever possible. No one investigates anything alone. Radio check-ins every 30 minutes. And most importantly, if you hear or see anything unusual, report it immediately but do not approach. They all nodded solemnly. These weren't rookies who would scoff at my warnings. These were survivors who had either witnessed something themselves or had lost friends to the forest. We headed out in a tight formation, following the hikers' registered route. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds sang, no small animals rustled in the underbrush, just the sound of our boots on the trail and our measured breathing. "I always hated this section," Morales said quietly as we passed through a particularly dense stand of pines. "Lost my partner here back in 2017. I remembered. His partner had followed what she thought was a lost child's voice. They never found enough of her to bury. By mid-afternoon, we reached the coordinates where the hikers had planned to make camp. What we found made my stomach tighten with familiar dread. The campsite was perfectly intact. 3 tents stood in a neat triangle around a stone-ringed fire pit where embers still glowed faintly. A cooking pot sat on a camp stove, 3 bowls of half-eaten stew beside it. 3 folding chairs were positioned around the fire, one tipped over as if someone had stood up suddenly. "It looks like they just vanished," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mid-meal," I added, examining the bowls. The stew was cold, but not completely dried out. "This happened yesterday, maybe the day before." We spread out, but not too far, searching the immediate area for any sign of the hikers. Their backpacks remained in their tents. All their gear was accounted for. Their phones, wallets, and IDs were still there. Even their boots were neatly lined up outside each tent. "Captain," Garcia called, pointing to something at the edge of the clearing. "Footprints." I moved to examine them. 3 sets of barefoot prints led from the campsite into the trees. No signs of struggle, no drag marks, just 3 people who apparently removed their boots and walked barefoot into the dense forest. "They wouldn't have done this willingly," Blackwood said, stating what we all knew. "We follow the prints but stay together," I ordered, checking my watch. "We've got about 3 hours of daylight left." The barefoot tracks led us nearly a mile from the campsite before abruptly ending, not fading gradually, not veering off, just stopping as if the hikers had been plucked from the ground. "We need to head back to the campsite," I said, noting the lengthening shadows. "Set up a base there for the night." No one argued. We all knew what happened in these woods after dark. Back at the campsite, we established our own camp adjacent to the hikers, not disturbing their site in case forensics teams needed to examine it later. As darkness fell, we built up the fire and established a watch rotation. "I'll take first watch," I said. "Thompson, you're with me. The rest of you try to get some sleep." But sleep wouldn't come easy for any of us that night. The voices started just after 10 o'clock. "Hello? Is someone there? Please help us." It was a woman's voice, likely Sarah Mitchell based on the recordings her family had provided. It came from the darkness beyond our firelight, maybe 50 yards away. Thompson tensed beside me, his hand moving to his flashlight. "Don't," I warned quietly. Rule 6. The others were awake now, emerging from their tents with wary expressions. "Please, we're lost. Michael is hurt." The voice was moving, circling our perimeter just beyond the reach of our light. Then a man's voice joined in. "Hello, Rangers? We can see your fire. We're coming toward you." I stood up, motioning for everyone to gather close. "Form a circle," I instructed. "Backs to each other, facing out. Keep your lights pointed outward, but stay on the trail. Do not respond to the voices." We formed our defensive circle as the voices multiplied. First the 3 hikers, calling with increasing desperation. Then other voices joined in, voices I recognized with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Bentley, it's Jerry. Man, I've been looking for you for years. Just step into the trees so we can talk." Jerry Diaz, my partner, dead for 7 years, his throat torn out by something wearing a missing woman's face. "Bentley, please. I'm scared out here." Jason Parker's voice now, the rookie who'd vanished 4 years ago after approaching those two perfect elderly hikers. One by one, the voices of every ranger who'd disappeared over the 15 years I'd worked at Banff joined the chorus. Some I'd known personally, others were just names in memorial plaques, all of them calling, pleading, begging us to help them. "Don't listen," I said firmly, seeing Ruth's face pale as a voice called her name specifically. "They're not real. They've never been real." "What the hell are they?" Blackwood whispered, his knuckles white around his flashlight. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but they want us to break the rules, to step off the trail, to go to them." The voices grew more insistent as the night deepened. Their pleas turned to threats. "We're coming for you, Bentley," Jerry's voice snarled, no longer sounding like my old friend. "You can't retire. You belong to the forest now. You think your rules will save you?" Jason's voice mocked. "Rules are for the living." Something massive moved just beyond our flashlight beams. Not human-shaped, something that seemed to flow between the trees like liquid shadow. The ground trembled slightly with each movement. "Hold your positions," I ordered, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Dawn is coming. They always retreat at dawn." The night stretched endlessly. The voices grew so loud they seemed to press against us physically. The massive shadow circled closer, occasionally reaching tendrils of darkness toward our circle, only to pull back when our lights hit them directly. Ruth stood at my back, her breathing controlled but rapid. "They know you're leaving," she said softly. "They're making a special effort for you." I nodded grimly. 15 years I've survived them. They're not happy about it. The voices reached a fevered pitch around 3 in the morning, a cacophony of familiar and strange sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground shook more violently as the shadow thing made increasingly aggressive approaches. Then, as the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky, everything stopped. The voices cut off mid-plea. The shadow retreated into the deeper forest. The unnatural silence returned, then gradually gave way to normal morning sounds. Birds cautiously beginning to sing, small animals rustling in the underbrush. We maintained our circle until full daylight broke through the trees. "We made it," Thompson said, lowering his flashlight with a shaking hand. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. "Stay together. We need to search the area." We moved out in formation, checking a perimeter around the campsite. Ruth was the one who found it, about a quarter-mile east of camp, just off the main trail. "Bentley," she called, her voice tight with horror. "Over here." What we found confirmed my worst fears. The remains of 3 people, identifiable as human only by scraps of clothing and scattered personal effects, had been arranged in a deliberate pattern on the forest floor. The pattern resembled a crude symbol, like something between a spiral and a star. The bodies had been partially consumed. Bones gnawed clean in some places, flesh shredded in others. "Radio it in," I told Garcia, turning away from the grisly scene. "Tell them we found the hikers." As the team documented the site and called for recovery teams, Ruth approached me where I stood apart, staring into the now innocent-looking forest. "This was for you, wasn't it?" she asked quietly. "One final attempt before you leave." I nodded slowly. 15 years I've survived by following the rules, teaching others to follow them. The forest doesn't like to lose. Ruth would be taking over my patrol route after I left. She'd been skeptical when she first arrived, like most rookies, but she'd learned quickly after the Jason Parker incident. "I used to think your rules were just superstition," she said, looking back at the team still photographing the terrible scene. "Old ranger stories to scare the new kids. And now?" She met my gaze steadily. "Now I know they're the only reason any of us are still alive." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "Keep teaching them, Ruth. To everyone who will listen." As we hiked back toward headquarters later that day, I felt the weight of 15 years on my shoulders. 5 more days and I'd be leaving Banff forever. But I knew, as the forest knew, that part of me would always remain here, in the rules I'd created, in the lives they might save, and in whatever waited in the darkness beyond the trails. I stood at attention in the headquarters conference room as Captain Wilson held up the walnut plaque, its brass plate catching the light. The room was packed with Rangers from all shifts, some I hadn't seen in months. "Ranger Bentley Owens," Wilson announced, his voice carrying the formal tone he reserved for ceremonies. "For 15 years of exemplary service to Banff National Park and its visitors, we present you with this token of our appreciation." I stepped forward to accept the plaque, feeling its solid weight in my hands. The brass plate read, "Ranger Bentley Owens, 15 years of dedicated service, Banff National Park." Below that, in smaller letters, "Your vigilance kept many safe." The double meaning wasn't lost on me. Wilson extended his hand and I shook it firmly. "You've earned this retirement, Bentley," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then, lowering his voice, "Not many make it this long." The room filled with applause. I scanned the faces of my colleagues, some young and fresh, others weathered like mine. I wondered how many would still be here in 5 years, how many would listen to the rules I'd established. After giving a short, awkward speech thanking the Park Service for the opportunity to serve, I endured the standard retirement party rituals. Cake with my name spelled correctly for once, handshakes from administrators I barely knew, and stories from colleagues about my more conventional rescues and achievements. Nothing about the other incidents, of course, not in mixed company. As the formal ceremony wound down, people began to drift away in small groups. The administrative staff left first, followed by the maintenance crews and seasonal rangers. I noticed Ruth Chen by the door, catching my eye with a subtle nod toward the east trail break room. Message received. An hour later, after the last of the cake had been wrapped up and the conference room cleared, I made my way to the east trail break room. This smaller space, tucked away from the main building, had become an unofficial gathering spot for veteran rangers. As I pushed open the door, the conversation inside immediately stopped. 7 rangers sat in a loose circle, all veterans with at least 5 years of service. Ruth Chen, Thompson, Garcia, Morales, Blackwood, and 2 others I recognized, but hadn't worked with closely. All of them had survived long enough to know the truth about Banff. "There he is," Thompson said, raising a paper cup filled with what I suspected wasn't just coffee. "The man who outlasted the forest." Ruth pulled out a chair for me. "We wanted a proper send-off, just us." I settled into the chair, placing my plaque on the table. "Thanks." The cake was dry anyway. That broke the tension, and a round of genuine laughter filled the room. Garcia reached into a bag and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, pouring a shot into my empty coffee cup. "To Bentley," he said, raising his own cup, "who taught us how to stay alive." We drank, and the real stories began to flow. Not the sanitized versions from the official ceremony, but the truth about what we'd all seen in the park. Thompson told about the time he'd found a perfect circle of dead animals arranged around his tent during a 3-day patrol. Morales described a night when the stars above her campsite had rearranged themselves into impossible patterns. Garcia shared his encounter with a hiker who'd been reported dead 3 days earlier in a different park entirely. "I wouldn't have known what to do if you hadn't taught me the rules," Ruth said, her voice steady but eyes serious. "That first year, when I heard the crying, I would have gone straight to it if you hadn't warned me." The others nodded, each with their own story of how my rules had saved them. "The rules work," Blackwood said, "but only if people listen." His gaze dropped to the table. "Not everyone does." The room fell quiet as we all thought about those who hadn't made it. Jerry, Jason, Tim, Autumn, Anthony. Too many names. "I have something for you, Ruth," I said, breaking the silence. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges from years of handling. "Since you're taking over my patrol route." Ruth's eyes widened as I placed it on the table. She recognized it immediately. My survival journal. She'd seen me writing in it after incidents. "Everything I've seen and learned in 15 years, I explained. All 6 rules plus detailed accounts of every encounter, locations, patterns, seasons when certain things are more active. Ruth picked up the journal with careful hands. "Bentley, I can't." "You can and you will," I cut her off. "Someone needs to keep track. Someone needs to teach the new ones." She nodded slowly, understanding the responsibility I was passing to her. "There's a map in the back," I continued. "Areas marked in red are places I never patrol alone. Areas in black are places I don't go at all, not anymore." The veterans exchanged glances. They all had their own mental maps of places to avoid. "Why do you think it's like this here?" Ruth asked, the question hanging in the air. "Why Banff?" I shook my head. I stopped asking why a long time ago. Knowing wouldn't change anything. We talked until midnight, sharing stories and warnings, passing knowledge that would never appear in any official report or training manual. When we finally said our goodbyes, each ranger hugged me, something that never happened in our usual professional interactions. They knew what it meant to survive 15 years in these woods. I slept fitfully that night, waking several times to check my cabin windows and doors. Old habits. Morning came with pale light filtering through my curtains. I packed methodically, loading boxes into my truck. 15 years in Banff fit into surprisingly few containers. The cabin looked bare without my things, just another temporary shelter waiting for its next occupant. With the truck loaded and my resignation papers signed, I had one thing left to do. I changed into my ranger uniform one last time and set out on foot for a final walk through the trails I'd patrolled for so long. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. I walked slowly, taking in the familiar sights. The bend in the river trail where I'd first met the thing pretending to be Colin Maldonado, the junction where I'd heard the child's voice calling my name, the clearing where I'd trained rookies and lost Jason. The forest felt different today. Usually, I sensed its attention only in moments of danger or when something unusual was happening. Today, I felt watched with every step. The trees seemed to lean slightly inward along the path. Birds fell silent as I passed. Even the wind died down when I entered denser sections of forest. It knew I was leaving. I followed the main trail to Bow River Overlook, a scenic spot popular with tourists for its views of the valley. The trail widened as it approached the viewing platform, then narrowed again as it continued along the ridge. Except today, the continuing path was blocked. A massive pine tree stood directly across the trail, a tree that hadn't been there yesterday during my final patrol. Its trunk was thick and gnarled, bark darker than the surrounding pines. What struck me most was how cleanly it blocked the path. No disturbed earth, no broken undergrowth, no root system visible, as if it had simply appeared overnight or perhaps had always been there in some impossible way. I stopped 15 feet from it, maintaining my distance. This was no coincidence. After 15 years of playing its games and surviving its traps, the forest was acknowledging my departure in its own way. "I'm leaving now," I said aloud, feeling foolish but compelled to speak. "Someone else will walk these trails." The branches didn't move, but I felt a shift in the air, a heaviness, like the moment before a thunderstorm. I backed away slowly, never turning my back on the tree, and retraced my steps to the main trail junction. The walk back to headquarters passed without incident, though the feeling of being watched intensified. By the time I reached my truck, I was sweating despite the cool morning. I turned in my radio and park keys to the front desk, exchanged final handshakes with the staff on duty, and walked to my truck. Ruth stood by the staff parking lot, my journal visible in her hand. "I'll keep them alive," she promised as I approached. "I know you will," I replied. We didn't hug or shake hands, just a nod of understanding between two people who knew what lurked in the trees. I climbed into my truck and started the engine. The dashboard clock read 10:15 in the morning, plenty of daylight left for the drive to Calgary. I'd rented an apartment there, somewhere urban and crowded and normal. As I drove toward the park exit, I kept my eyes on the road ahead. The main gate came into view, its wooden arch marking the boundary between Banff and the outside world. I slowed as I approached, a habit from thousands of entries and exits over the years. Just as I passed under the arch, something made me glance in the rearview mirror. They stood in a line at the park boundary, figures in various states of ranger uniforms. Jerry Diaz was in front, looking exactly as he had the day before he died. Next to him stood Jason Parker, the rookie who'd vanished 4 years ago. Behind them, I could make out Tim Navarro, Autumn Singh, and others, all the missing rangers from my 15 years of service. Their faces were blank, expressionless. They didn't wave or call out, they simply stood watching my departure. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I knew they weren't really there. This was one last attempt, one final lure to draw me back across the boundary. Rule number 7, I thought to myself. When you leave, don't look back. Don't stop. Don't return. I pressed the gas pedal and drove away, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The figures in my mirror remained at the boundary, unable or unwilling to cross. I had survived 15 years by following the rules I'd created. Those rules would stay behind with Ruth and the journal, protecting those who were smart enough to listen. But the knowledge, the awareness of what existed in those woods, that would stay with me. Some things once learned can never be unlearned, even in retirement.